Local Control Funding Formula 101, Understanding the New School Funding System, presented by Children Now.
Thank you very much, Jelena, and thank you so much, all of you, for joining this webinar. Some of you have been on past Children Now webinars dealing with the Local Control Funding Formula on an overview and state implementation, a focus on early learning. We're just very excited about kicking off this webinar series on community engagement today, and are just thrilled with not only the number, but the diversity of folks who are listening in today. School districts, state advocates, local advocates, community organizations, First Fives, just a range of organizations and individuals, which just really shows the enthusiasm and the excitement about community engagement and implementing this law and the local control funding formula. We recognize on this webinar that some of you have been working very hard in local control funding formula and are very familiar with a lot of technicalities. Some of you are just getting exposed to it for the first time, so we'll try to thread that needle, but feel free to contact us for more information afterwards. We do think it's really important, though, for this law to really meet its purpose, that folks are all on the same page as the implementation begins, and so that as school district leaders and school board members, community leaders, parents, students are all getting the same information, so we all start from the same place, and that's a key goal of what we're trying to accomplish with today's webinars and subsequent issues. The last thing I'll say before turning it over to Samantha Tran is that the community engagement is really at the heart of this new law. I remember a number of folks coming to me last year when we were working and advocating for this law to be passed, saying, oh my goodness, if this local control funding passes, this program won't be funded. We'll lose this program, we'll lose that program. And I realized what the folks were saying was if Sacramento wasn't telling us to do it, it wouldn't happen. Well, that's not the world we live in anymore. That the state plays an absolutely crucial role in terms of accountability and oversight. Really, so many of the programmatic decisions of where the dollars will go really now rest in the hands of local school districts and are required to make sure that they are listening to the community and parents and students and community stakeholders as they make those decisions. So it's going to be an exciting, bumpy road, but all for the benefit of all the kids in this state. So with that overview, just thank you so much for being here today, and I'm turning it over to Samantha Tran, our Senior Director of Education Policy.
Thanks, Ted. So before we get started, I want to just provide a couple of updates on kind of the progression that we're going to take. As Ted mentioned, we're really going to try and thread the needle here and make sure that we're providing accurate information, but that it's very accessible. And so really laying the groundwork so that everyone can engage in this conversation locally. I also like to say thank you to all the folks that participated in the survey that led up to the development of this webinar. It really informed our thinking, and we put out a lot of different questions of places where people could engage in terms of the type of information we should present. And two key things came back to us in terms of what we need right now. One was an understanding of how this new formula works, how the dollars get from Sacramento to local school districts and county offices and charters, and then how those agencies can then turn around and use the dollars to support students and schools. And so we're going to walk you through that. And then the second piece was, again, wanting more information about this new planning process, the Local Control Accountability Plan, what it means, what it looks like, and really why it's so fundamentally important. So we're going to take the time to walk through that piece as well. We'll end with talking a little bit about next steps in terms of places where you can continue to stay engaged at the state level, and then upcoming information items that we'll be sharing. And again, want to hear from you in terms of what information would be most useful as you do the most important work at the local level. But before we do all that, I want to talk a little bit about the vision, why LCFF is different and why it's so fundamentally important and matters. So a little bit about the background. What is LCFF? As Ted mentioned, this is a massive change. We're talking about $42 billion this year that is going to be allocated to public education in a different way, in a way that honors both equity and local flexibility. And the big idea is that the state is going to set the big priority areas that every community needs to look at and review, but at the local level, those goals and indicators can be based on local need, tailoring it to the student population that you have, and really provide the opportunity to do innovative approaches and evidence-based implementation efforts. So this is actually a long time in coming. It's funny, we've been going up and down the state talking with various groups, school leaders, community groups, and the media and other partners. And I think for some there was this surprise that LCFF happened so quote unquote quickly over the last year, and then a little bit obviously the prior year. But this was a long time in the making. I mean, this took nearly 4 decades for this process to happen. And it really goes back to things that happened in the 70s when we changed how schools were funded, primarily being state funded. There was some litigation that was focused on equity that set the groundwork for LCFF. And then in the decades in between, a whole lot of things that built up over time, making the system so convoluted and complex that virtually no one could understand it, and that doesn't bode well for public trust. And so over the last decade, there's really been a lot of work, research, policy work, legislative attempts to begin the conversation. And so the last year was honestly a capstone, and Governor Brown's leadership on this was critical. So this was a long time in the making, and really what it's trying to do are some core things. It changes how California sends the money from the state down to the local level, and it really prioritizes equity in that process, basically saying we need to make sure that we're making significant investments in our most vulnerable populations and our high-need kids. And then once it gets down to the local level, there's a lot of flexibility in terms of how those dollars can be spent. But the big change here at the local level is that a plan needs to be in place that is linked to the entire budget. And again, I know many of us have been involved in planning processes where you develop a plan and then it sits on the shelf, but I think this really has the potential to be fundamentally different because it's a plan that represents the entire dollars that schools and districts are working with. So it creates a real opportunity for change. So with that, I'm going to turn it over to Deborah Brown, who will walk us through how this new funding model works.
Thank you, Samantha. Good morning, everybody. Yeah, we want to take some time to really review what the funding formula means and how the dollars are to be spent locally. We've spent some time over the last several months really talking about this as a process that we've been going through where the legislature adopted a framework, but then the State Board of Education has really been debating the issue over the last several months, and we've provided those updates, but now we wanted to take the opportunity to talk about what we have in front of us now that the board has adopted emergency regulations and really provide the whole picture. So for some folks this might be a little bit of review, and then for others it might be new, but we'll work through sort of the basic principles here. One of the key elements here is that LCFF does really change the way California sends out dollars. We've moved from a system of earmarking dollars but to now a system where we're really being focused and targeted. So you'll see also in connection with that we are in a period of economic recovery, in large part thanks to Proposition 30. And so we're talking about significant dollars for LCFF. So we're looking at about $41 billion for LCFF and up to $46 billion in the next school year. So in the school year that starts July 1st, 2014. And when just as a note that this does represent not all of the funding that goes to school. So there's about $50 billion that'll go to K-12 this year and about $54 billion next year. And then we do like to make the caveat that while this is significant funding, it is still far from adequate and still far from what our schools need. As was mentioned earlier, schools spent years making some deep and significant cuts, and they're really trying to make their way out of the cuts that they made in the Great Recession. And so really what that means is that districts are only getting back to about 2007 funding levels at the end of this transition period that I'll talk a little bit more about, so really after about 8 years, we'll really only be back to where we were in 2007. And then just a final note on this, just this idea as we look where California ranks, we are 49th in funding when you compare to other states. So we still have a lot of work on that area. But as we move forward, the good news is that we are moving forward in a way with new dollars, in a way that makes sense, and not continuing to invest in an irrational system. And so moving ahead to diving into what LCFF it does is, so rather than providing uneven dollar amounts to districts for a base or general purpose funding, and then providing categoricals that districts may or may not be able to use effectively, LCFF tries to simplify the way that the state sends money to local districts, and so it does so by providing a base amount for all students, and as you can see from this chart, it is broken down by grade span, so recognizing the differences in the cost to educate students, particularly at the higher grade levels. And then there are some add-ons that look at providing some more money because related to class size reduction. So this idea that reducing class sizes for students in K-3 does cost more money, and so there's an add-on for that. And then there is an add-on later on in the high school years, in part to recognize some additional funding that districts were receiving for career and technical education. And then the significant change here is that the state recognizes that certain kids do need more resources and more support. And so for students that are falling into what we call a category of for supplemental dollars or high need students, and how the state has defined that as students from low income families, students who are English learners, and foster youth, and really making a significant commitment to those students by providing additional dollars. And so what that means is 20% more of the base funding will go to students who qualify. And then building upon that, recognizing that students who attend schools or in districts and live in communities that have higher concentrations of high need students really do have a higher level need, even beyond their counterparts in less high need areas. And so they've provided what's called a concentration factor, and so that's for districts that have more than 55% of their students are either English learners, low income, or foster youth, and they will get an additional 55% an additional 50% of funding for all students above that 55% threshold. And then just one final note on this is that, and which we sort of referenced in the previous slide, was that there is significant funding that is still outside of the LCFF, and so primarily that is special education programs, and so there still exists those pockets of money for those programs, so special education, early education, and those are outside of LCFF. And so because the state wanted to make sure that all districts were growing rather than trying to sort of rearrange the existing pot of money, we really had to develop a transitional model. And so what that says is that we're going to take the funding that districts got last year, so in the last school year, which was 2012-13, and we're going to transition over time as the state's economy and budget will allow. And so the state really is making a progression towards getting all districts to receiving the same dollar amount for each student that is similar, but that will take time. And so we're on what's a transition model, and this is important because this really speaks to how districts will be able to make investments in the future that while it's significant money now, it really is going to come to districts over time. And so also what LCFF means for all students is that it is a reinvestment in our schools after years of deep cuts, and it also does allow districts to define goals and meet what they have determined as their local priorities with the help of their community, rather than the state deciding what supports and services they will provide. And so not only is it a shift in terms of how funding is, but it's also a shift in terms of decision making and goal setting. And then, then as I mentioned earlier, that LCFF really does call out a group of kids that do need some additional supports and services. And so the formula for calculating so within the formula, there's this calculation about how much money needs to be spent on these students, and I'll talk a little bit more about that in just a minute. And then the funding for targeted programs for high-needs students can be provided on a school-wide or district-wide basis. And so that can serve additional students as well, and can be part of a more comprehensive and systemic approach to meeting the needs of students. And then districts and county offices will have to describe their funding, will support those actually all students, and then also high-needs students. And Eduardo will talk about a little bit more about, I should say, a lot more about that in just a few minutes. And so this is the part where, so the first part is really that's been part of the law for the last several months, and it's what districts have been operating under now. But what we've been talking about much is this how much needs to be spent on high-needs students, and that's been the deep conversation over the last several months as folks have grappled with that. And ultimately, it was a state board decision, and they established a formula for defining that and for deciding how much districts are required to spend on high-needs students. And it's fortunately is a formula and is a simple formula. And so what districts will need to do is they'll have to define a starting point. And really it has to be as much as they spent on certain students under an existing program in the prior year. And so each district will have a different starting point because it will be based on how they've made investments and allocated resources in the past. So that does allow districts flexibility in determining it. And then, as I mentioned earlier, there is this idea that we have this target that we're going to grow to over time. And so we need to know how much that target is. And each year, districts will calculate what's called a gap. So it's their current level of funding versus what their target is. And then the level of investment will be determined by how much money the state is providing for districts and how much of that gap that they can close. And so it's really sort of these four key points, which is a starting point, a target, the gap, and investment. And what that means is that districts will have different levels of funding that they'll be spending on high-needs students based on what they spent in the previous years, also how far they are from their target over time. And so this will be important as districts are grappling this to understand what this means. And so that is it seems fairly complicated and really digging into the weeds and budget numbers a bit, but it is important. And maybe an easier way to look at that concept will be watching districts' progression over time towards that target and how much of the funds they are spending on high-needs students. And so what part of the requirements now that districts have to do is they have to demonstrate their proportional progress towards their target with each year. And again, here, they have to break out the funding that they're getting. So they take their supplemental and concentration dollars. So it's that funding that they're getting for their high-needs students. And then their proportion is really by dividing that by the base. And so districts will be able to demonstrate how they're making investments over time towards their high-needs students, and ultimately will get to the targets that the funding level provides. And so this formula and this calculation will be a good guide for folks to use because it is fairly simple and will demonstrate progress over time. And then diving deeper will be how districts are allocating those dollars, which obviously is a huge question. That will come through the development of the district's LCAP. And one of the other key areas that the state has been trying to address is this idea of school-wide and district-wide. And so what that means is of the supplemental and concentration dollars that high-needs students are generating, how can they be spent? Can they be spent for programs and services that benefit only those students, or is there a way to do these sort of system-wide reform strategies and really targeted prevention efforts that can focus on a whole population and really reduce the achievement gap, and to the extent that a student who didn't generate those additional dollars might benefit, is an important effort, and districts will need to look at that and make those determinations for themselves. But this is an important element for consideration, again, because this idea that research shows that these system-wide efforts can really be effective in closing achievement gaps. But there is that caveat at the end that it has to be, it's important though to make sure that the funding isn't watered down so that high need students aren't receiving any differential benefit from how those dollars are used, because again, that is a fundamental concept of LCFF, is making sure that high need students do get additional supports and services. So an important element of that is making sure that that balance is being met. And so how the state has defined that is really by setting a threshold for the use of supplemental dollars for a district-wide purpose, and they set the threshold at 55%. And for students, so if their population of high-need students is above 55%, they may use those supplemental concentration dollars for a district-wide purpose. And they have to meet two things. In their LCAP, they have to identify the services that are being provided and then describe how those services will help meet the district's goals for high-need students. And for schools, that threshold is 40%. So if they wanted to provide a school-wide program, 40% of their students need to be high-need students, so English learners, foster youth, or from low-income families, and then they need to answer those two questions in their LCAP. But the law doesn't say that you cannot use those dollars for a district-wide or school-wide purpose if you're below that threshold. It sets in a third element that has to be included in the LCAP, which is that the LCAP has to, and the district has to explain why this is the most effective use of the funds for meeting the goal. So why they would be using supplemental and concentration dollars where they don't have those higher concentrations, and how that is a more effective use of those funds than using them in a targeted fashion. And then one last thing on the funding that we did want to leave folks with, is which we've alluded to earlier, is this idea of districts being in different places depending on how they were, the position they were in, and how they were able to respond to the significant cuts that were made over the last several years. And so we've put this chart on here to show this continuum of where districts will be, because it will be important for determining where they end up and how much money they can allocate for new programs and services versus a restoration. And so we've tried to provide this in a way to show that it is a progression. And so, for example, this idea of which is particularly important is how much the districts cut on their core programs. So did they reduce the school year or significantly increase that class sizes? And so this idea that if they did make those significant cuts, that they're really in a different place and they're going to have to be making bigger commitments of their resources in the next few years to restoring those. And then looking at how that progressed. So some will continue to have to make cuts because they're in sort of this red zone where they've had to make significant cuts, their deficit spending, and then maybe they're not getting as much money ongoing. And then moving through to sort of this yellow column where maybe they did have to make deeper cuts to the core program, but they're able to restore them in the current year or the next year. And then moving forward to where maybe they were able to make some reductions, but they didn't have to significantly increase class sizes or cut the school year. And so they're really able to move forward and start making investments utilizing the LCFF dollars. And so this is really meant to show districts will be in different places on each of these categories. And so the idea that a district might be in the red on one category and a green on another really just speaks to the need to really understand and engage locally to find out what position the district is in. And so it's just important to be mindful of that as engagement starts, to understand the place by which you're starting, because that will help inform where you can go over the course of the next few years as districts and communities are making investments. So I think that wraps up sort of the recap and overview on the funding side of it. And with that, I'm going to turn it over to Eduardo to talk about how LCFF has significantly changed accountability.
Thank you so much, Deborah. All right, so that was a lot of information, so feel free to take a deep breath and just kind of regroup. This is going to be an introduction / review of some of the accountability components that you'll need to begin thinking about or flesh out with your teams as you're moving forward in the development of your LCAP. Okay, so what does the LCFF mean for accountability? There's a couple of key things that you'll need to keep in mind. The LCAP, the Local Control Accountability Plan, is due July 1st, so make sure that that date is on your calendar and that you're working backwards from that, and that you're also taking into account your district's own budget calendar, so that way you're not scheduling decisions at a date that the district is not able to act on them and include them in your budget. The other thing to keep in mind is that that the LCAP introduces a much stronger link between how the budget is allocated based on explicit outcomes. So kind of like Sam mentioned at the beginning, this is not an exercise in futility where you will be responsible for putting this big plan together and it'll sit on the shelf and nobody will really look at it until it's time for it to be reviewed. This actually presents a great opportunity for the district to work hand in hand with its community to begin to identify some common opportunities that will help promote student growth in ways that we haven't seen in the past, and to then also allocate the budgeting that will allow for that to come into fruition. And finally, in terms of the oversight of the school level or district level accountability, local control accountability plans, these will be the oversight will be provided by the County Office of Education. And so they're going to have a role in both reviewing the LCAP as well as providing some level of technical assistance in the instances where it is needed. Okay, going into some kind of big picture LCAP basics. Ultimately, the way that we would recommend the spirit of the LCAP is really to engage in a year-round community engagement strategy. And so this is an opportunity for you to really create the space for community to be involved kind of on these 4 key areas that essentially turn into a continuous improvement cycle for your district. And so just to kind of quickly go over the 4 components that you'll want to keep in mind as you're developing your plan moving forward. One is you really want to look at the assessment of need and the identification of assets within your community so that you're able to really kind of hone in on those data outcomes that you will be able to move forward on, and that your decisions are based on the reality that your communities are facing while being able to kind of identify where you'd like for them to go. And also being able to then kind of leverage those existing community assets so that you're not starting from scratch. The second piece of this cycle is the setting of actionable goals that kind of speaks to that, the work that you'll be doing around the assessment and the identification of assets. So really, this is going to be a 3-year plan, so make sure that you're approaching it in that way and set goals that you feel build upon each other over the course of time. So we're not saying don't shoot for the moon, but be realistic about what you'll be able to achieve in year 1, year 2, year 3, and then moving forward. The other key piece that you'll be able to, that the LCAP introduces for this entire process is the aligning of the outcomes with the spending plan. So unlike previous efforts that you may have been a part of where groups are brought together to identify goals, but then that's kind of left to decision makers to determine whether or not those will be funded, the LCAP presents an opportunity for that connection to be made much more explicitly at the beginning of the process. So make sure that that is something that you guys are dedicating the time and the energy and the supports to really bring about to its full fruition. And finally, the last component of this cycle is really the reviewing and the making any necessary adjustments for the following year. This, at a bare minimum, should be done on a yearly process. If you find yourself in a place where you have strong community participation and you've built the structures to do it on a more regular basis, we highly encourage you to do so. It'll just really position you for even higher outcomes moving forward. All right, so this is a quick breakdown of the 8 priority areas that are identified within the Local Control Accountability Plan. And so for those of you that have not really been able to kind of dive into it, this is just a quick snapshot of the 8 priorities. So just looking at the titles, and we encourage you to come back and review these in more detail later. But you have the first priority being basic supports, and that's making sure that every single student has access to a fully credentialed teacher that is prepared to teach their grade level, along with having access to standards-aligned materials and curriculum, and also that they have access to facilities that are well-maintained and that promote learning. On the second priority is the implementation of state standards. So this is incorporating the Common Core state standards and other California state standards that have been put into place or that will be introduced in the future. So kind of making sure that all of your materials are high quality and aligned with standards. The third priority that you see here is that of parent involvement, and really it's about engaging the parents and the community in a much more active dialogue, primarily around decision making, but also with regard to programming, so that you really kind of see that level of engagement increase at the school and district level. The fourth priority is pupil achievement. The LCAP primarily focuses on the measurement side of this priority, which is looking at things like standardized testing results, API scores, that's Academic Performance Index, as well as the number of students that demonstrate college and career readiness. And so as you're looking at developing your LCAP, you'll want to look at those outcomes and those actions that you can take to help make sure that your students are moving forward in those various indicators. The fifth priority being pupil engagement, making sure that students are wanting to be at school. And so again, the LCAP articulates the indicators that they'll be looking at more along the lines of absenteeism rates, a reduction in those, particularly around chronic absenteeism. And so making sure that you're implementing actions that help engage students on the campuses so that they will not want to be absent as much and will want to contribute to their overall achievement. The sixth priority being that of school climate. Again, here we'll be looking at a decrease in the number of students that are suspended or expelled from school, but ideally you're approaching this from a much more assets-based lens and looking at what kind of strategies you can incorporate on your campus that are going to reduce the number of students that will need to even be introduced to that process. The seventh priority is that of course access, so making sure that students have the opportunity to take the type of coursework that will allow for them to be college and career ready. And then the eighth and final outcome is kind of a bit of a catch-all. And so this eighth priority allows for the local districts to identify those priorities that they feel will help in achieving many of the other priorities that are identified here, but also allows for the state to kind of encourage folks to look at some of the other wellness related or kind of or type of outcomes that will ensure that students are receiving a well-rounded academic exposure. So this is just a quick snapshot. We'll be providing much more detailed information in future webinars, but just wanted to, at the very least, introduce you to the 8 priority areas. The next slide is going to introduce the categories that these 8 priorities have been placed into. And so the 3 categories that have been used or created are those of the first being conditions of learning, the second student outcomes, and the third engagement. We're going to go into a little bit more detail in the following slides on each of these. So starting with conditions of learning, this one incorporates the priorities that focus on making sure that students have access to credentialed teachers, standard aligned instructional materials, and access to well-maintained facilities, as well as sorry, I'm freezing on that. as well as the alignment to state standards of the materials, and then the access to courses that promote college and career readiness. You'll notice the plus around foster youth, though this is not included within the explicit A priority areas, given that foster youth are a priority subgroup that has been identified within the LCAP, we highly encourage you to kind of keep these students at the forefront in your thinking around the conditions of learning and making sure that you're working with the necessary partners and resources at the county level to ensure that there's a focus on the proper support of these students within your school districts and definitely articulated within your LCAP. Okay, shifting over to the student outcomes. Here, ultimately, this is the focus of the LCAP, right? Really, we want to focus on improving the achievement and outcomes for our kids. And so the priorities that are included here are those of higher performance, primarily as measured through standardized testing, API score, completion and passing of the advanced placement test and such. Another indicator for that student achievement is, of course, the college and career readiness. How many students are reporting being college and career ready, again, through the completion or the passing of things like the advanced placement exams. And finally, that of the number of English learners that successfully acquire a level of English speaking abilities that allow for them to be successful in their classes and allow for them to be reclassified within the system. And so making sure to additionally identify other outcomes within this section that target your subgroups that your district has. So shifting over to the engagement category, here's where you're going to see the priorities that speak to the need for elevated levels of parent involvement. Again, primarily as it relates to decision making, but also that we see the number of parents engaging in school level and district level programming just rise overall to kind of make sure that students are receiving that support both from home and at the school. Additionally, here you're going to see that student engagement appears, and this is, again, helping to create a space where students, teachers, parents all want to be. And so working with your community to identify what those outcomes actually, what that actually means for your community. And finally, you see the school climate, which again relates to creating that level of engagement for both students and parents. So really looking at the connectedness and as measured by a reduction in the level of suspension and expulsion rates for students. And so those will be some of the indicators that you'll need to kind of incorporate within your LCAP, but the bigger picture is really kind of creating spaces where people just want to be. Okay, so kind of just the next set of slides are just a quick preview of what you would find on your LCAP. And so we will be providing a lot more information on these moving forward, but for our purposes today, this is just going to be a quick review. Definitely recommend that you come back and just kind of look at some of the notes that we incorporated here. So there are 3 sections within the LCAP that you'll need to fill out. The first being that of stakeholder engagement. You can see here the purpose really is to identify and articulate what your plan was for engaging folks, how you engaged them, the opportunities that you created, and the actions that were taken as a result of those engagements. So making sure that you include language that speaks to those components. The second section, or still kind of related to the stakeholder engagement, at the bare minimum, your districts need to demonstrate that the LCAP was reviewed by the district's parent advisory committee. This can be an existing body, and if your district has 50% or more of English learners, or the other 50 students in your district, that it also be reviewed by the English Learner Advisory Committee before the LCAP is adopted formally. So at the bare minimum, those 2 groups need to be included within the decision-making process. Ideally, you're doing much more than that, though, and we know you will. Here, the goal behind that, of course, is really to kind of help make sure that there is a common understanding, support, and trust in the resulting LCAP. And so that we're moving away from the decision-making that takes place behind closed doors and really bringing it out into the open and working with community members to create a much more comprehensive understanding of what needs to happen and how we're going to work towards achieving that outcome. Shifting over to section number 2, that of goals and progress indicators. This is where you're going to start to identify those goals that you're going to have You're going to articulate, and I'll show you in the next slide what the table actually looks like. You'll identify the groups that are being targeted, as well as demonstrate kind of a incremental growth in your outcomes that you'll be shooting for. So again, we'll be providing much more information on these in the future. Here's the example of the table that we mentioned. This is relatively similar to what you would see on the sample LCAP template that's been sent out. Wrapping it up with section number 3, this is action, services, and expenditures. Here's where you begin to, the rubber hits the road, so to speak. So the goals that you identified, this is the section where you articulate the actions that will allow for you to achieve those goals, and then linking those actions to the expenditures that will need to be made in order to bring that about. So again, we know that we're really running through this right now. It's just an introduction. We will be going into these in much more detail in a later webinar, so I encourage you to kind of keep your eyes on your inbox for those announcements. This is the sample table that you would be filling out for that section number 3. As you can see, there's goals related to state and local priorities, actions, level of service, annual updates. We'll be providing more info on each one of those in the future. Ultimately, though, we know that everybody is kind of, both in terms of the scope of the work that needs to take place and the truncated timeline that we're all working on, we ask that at the bare minimum, or not we ask, the LCAP requires that at the bare minimum, your LCAP is reviewed by a district advisory committee before adoption, that the public is notified of opportunities to make comments on it, that you hold a public hearing that allows for the LCAP to be presented to the public and to collect comments from the public on it, and that a separate LCAP, a separate public hearing be held to actually adopt the LCAP, so that you have a minimum of 2 public hearings for the LCAP to be discussed at one and be adopted at the other. So with that quick run through, I'm going to have Sam come back on the line. Thank you all.
Excellent. Thanks, Eduardo. So one of the big picture questions, and we're going to be wrapping this up quickly, that we keep getting as we are out in the field talking with folks is, so what does LCFF mean in terms of how we're holding schools accountable, both for how they spend their money and for student outcomes? And I think you heard a little bit about that. Well, you heard a lot about that in terms of the funding, right? So the LCFF impacts the $42 billion that's sent out, to public education around its core programming. The county's going to review those budgets and provide technical assistance. Again, it's not all the state funding, but it's a large portion of it. And so LCFF significantly impacts fiscal and funding oversight. And again, it also impacts how we think about outcome accountability for students. It specifically changes the way at the local level people are looking at their goals and their outcome data for kids, and they're linking it to their budget. Again, the county is going to provide a review and technical assistance at the support level as they're doing that process. But there are some key state elements related to outcome accountability that are still in flux. And we won't go into these at length, but just know that there's an interplay between the local work that's happening and then our shifts at the state level around our standards and our assessment system, and how we ultimately provide technical assistance and intervention in the local level when you have struggling schools. So there's going to be continued policy work and development on that front, but LCFF does make this pivot and change and really creates a broader dynamic for what we call successful, and brings in these other indicators that I know community groups and parents and educators care deeply about, in addition to test scores and graduation rates. So, and then this is also an important point to note, while we've made a major change in California around our finance system, it does not change anything at the federal level. So all the federal rules still apply, for federal categorical programs. For our intervention system, we have a kind of a 2-tiered intervention system right now that's based on the old rules, and then some districts that have waivers. So that's a distinct process, and so our overall accountability system is in flux, but LCFF definitely has some core elements that are interrelated. So moving forward, what are some of the places where you can stay engaged? As we mentioned, the state board has adopted these preliminary rules that will help with the planning for this year, and it's starting the process for completely adopting the permanent regulations, and that will be an iterative process, but right now is actually the time to weigh in at the state level on those permanent regs. They mirror the emergency regs, so as we've been talking, it's the same set of regs that are actually before the board. They're taking public comment, and the best way to actually engage on this front is to submit a letter. The deadline is March 17th. There'll be a public hearing, but it's not the same day as the normally scheduled board hearing, but it's more of an administrative process. So the letter writing might be the most effective kind of strategy on this front. In addition to the state level work, we're, as we mentioned before, going to try and provide lots of different opportunities, both from Children Now and then obviously in partnership with a lot of our core organizations up and down the state. The most immediate is actually Monday. We're hosting a tweet chat from 11 to noon around community engagement, and so there are actually several dozens of groups, so from school districts to community partners to statewide groups to local groups that are going to be participating in this chat, really sharing resources and exchanging information about what's working, who has good ideas, where are some good materials. So if you're interested, please participate, and then we'll keep these webinar series going and also our website. So with that, I'm going to turn it back to Ted to make sure we have time for a little bit of Q&A.
Thank you, Sam, and Deborah and Eduardo for that great overview. And we do have a number of questions. The first one is best case scenario after the transition, where would we rank nationwide in funding schools? And Sam might want to just jump in, but I'd just say briefly that what's really important to recognize with LCFF is that we're addressing one huge issue with California school funding, and that is breaking down the command and control from Sacramento and making sure we really have a focus on equity. But it doesn't really address the overall funding issue where recent reports have suggested we are really near the bottom. And so it's important, and this is something that districts have emphasized, and correctly so, that overall we still rank very, very low compared to most states. Certainly some districts do better than others under local control funding formula, and there is significant dollars coming in, but it doesn't affect our overall ranking. And Sam, I didn't know if you just wanted to say anything else in response to that question.
Yeah, and that's a hard one to determine, obviously, because it's going to depend on whether or not we in California prioritize this investment and decide to allocate more dollars on this front. And we have different mechanisms we could use, either through the state budget process or additional revenue, and then honestly what other states do at the same time. So I'm hopeful that there will be a lot of conversation about this, especially since Prop 30 is going to be phased out here shortly, and we're going to have this conversation.
Great. So the next question is squarely in terms of today's focus, and Sam, Deborah, Eduardo, whoever wants to handle this one. I've heard administrators say that the LCAP does not say that parents have to approve it. Can you clarify this message that was given during a meeting with parents?
So technically, that is correct. The governing board, the school board for a school district, a charter school, and a county office make the final decision in terms of adopting the budget and adopting the LCAP. The reason we are consistently talking about community engagement at every step of the way is both it's required in the statute, and so there are touch points where you have to share this with your community and get feedback and provide written feedback. So there are process things that are required, but if you just do the process pieces, the fundamental spirit of the law and really the mutual benefit is going to be lost, because as we're saying, we're talking about prioritizing scarce resources, and if that's done in a kind of closed door process, it does not breed trust, and you're not going to be able to tap into those community assets. We know that this is a major shift in how many communities are approaching this. There are many districts and charters and county offices that have done this for a long time. But this creates a real opportunity, and I think we all need to give each other the space to learn and grow together, because this is a new dynamic and there's a lot of work to be done. I don't know. Okay, great, thanks.
Great. So there's several questions that also have the same theme, so I'll read a couple, but then make sure you address them. And the essential theme is how does a district deal with changes from year to year? So let me just read a couple of specific questions. Annually, will districts get to relook at the funding plan they have developed and approved and be able to make funding changes based on need and funding requirements? Another question, how locked in is a district to their LCAP? Can they make mid-year changes in year one of the plan? What about years 2 and 3? So there's a couple others, but why don't I just stop with those two if you want to comment on those?
Yeah, no, absolutely. So these are 3-year plans. The expectation, actually the requirement, is that they are updated annually, and they're supposed to be living documents. And so we know budgets are the best estimate of how things are going to unfold, but you need to be responsive to the fiscal dynamic that's playing out. And so there's certainly room for that. The other piece that I would mention is that the Department of Finance, in anticipation of some of this, is trying to put out estimates about the over the 3-year process, how much money is likely to come in. Now, these are forecasts, so they're rough, but they give you a sense of how to approach it. One of the dynamics that we're hearing too that we're sensitive to is, how do you make conservative, realistic budgets, but then also have the opportunity that if additional dollars come in, knowing where you're going to make those investments. And I think that's something, again, where as the field's working through this process, we want to work with partners to begin identifying best practices and really share that very broadly, because I think this is going to be one of the core areas of learning for all of us.
Great. And so in the same vein, the next question, if the formula for how much to spend on high-need students is dependent on the target amount of supplemental concentration dollars at full implementation, what happens if the population changes in the school district over the next 8 years or so?
Yeah, no, this definitely has to be very responsive to the changing demographics, and we do know that in some communities this is more of an issue than in others in terms of mobility. The target is based on your current demographics, but we know those demographics are going to change, and so those adjustments are going to happen each year. I believe, Deborah, it's a 3-year kind of average in terms of the dollar amounts, right? So it kind of it accommodates for a little bit of the flux in demographics.
Right. So two things. Sam's right. I think the key is that when you look at your target, it's based on your population essentially in that current year. But the dynamic, which is that for the counts of those high-need students, English learners and low-income and foster youth, is based on a 3-year average, so that if there are significant declines or changes in the population, that doesn't result in significant changes in funding negatively.
Great. So the next two questions deal with county offices of education in two very separate questions. So the first is, will the county offices, county districts essentially have to make their own LCAPs? How does the LCFF relate to county funding? Do they get the same base rate and same formula? So essentially, several questions there just about how county offices of education are treated under the formula.
Thanks. County offices broadly are treated the same way. So they do have to develop LCAPs each year, and they have to go through very similar requirements in terms of engagement and review, although their review is done by the superintendent. But they still have to adopt an LCAP, and then they have additional requirements with regards to foster youth, which Eduardo had mentioned, and then also for students who are in the juvenile justice system. So they have a little different requirements, but essentially the same thing as far as the LCAP is concerned. And then their funding is different from that for districts and charters, but follows the same concept. But because county offices serve two roles, they are a provider of services for students, but they also have a support and administrative role for districts. And so their funding, the funding formula in LCFF reflects those the two roles that they have.
Great. The next question, also county offices, I think this one's pretty straightforward. Who exactly at the county level will approve the district plans? I assume the answer is the county superintendent?
The county
superintendent approves it. So the county superintendent currently approves district budgets, and they will then have to approve the LCAP as well. So it is the county superintendent.
Great. So the next question, can these LCFF dollars fund pre-kindergarten areas of need?
Absolutely. So one of the things that is really great about the way the funding formula is set up is that, it's this new allocation model from the state down to the local level, but at the local level, there's a lot of flexibility to invest, especially in high impact areas, and we know that early learning is absolutely a place where there's a major yield from investing in students early on. In addition, the district could also serve other age populations. It doesn't just have to be K-12, but there's a lot of flexibility and I think a lot of impact on that front. And we have a whole other webinar series just on that issue, if folks are interested.
Great. Yeah, just on that, those of you that are interested as well, in addition to webinars, we have a toolkit and some updates for local early learning advocates to use. So we'll certainly be having additional information there. The next question, I want to make sure I get this right, but it's essentially focused on accountability, how outcomes like art and physical education, where they fall under the priority areas, and just in terms of how they fit into the way we've been describing the law today. Sorry, not making that more clear. The question was a little.
No, it's clear because it's an issue actually that's come up a lot. It's in that bucket around other outcomes. Actually, and it's also in the standards bucket because we do have standards related to physical education and the arts. So it's in both places. And one of the key elements to remember when local districts and communities are developing their LCAP is that all of those priority areas need to be touched upon. But the way in which they're touched upon, you could have one big goal in terms of what you're trying to, several big goals. And within each of those goals, it can encompass multiple priority areas. So they all have to be addressed, and arts and physical education are absolutely in that context and a part of the law.
Great. So we have time for one more question, and this is a good closing question given the focus day. So are there standard output strategies for the touch points for communicating to elicit parent community voice? What is the accountability measure for ensuring fair and equitable communication and outreach? This whole plan is contingent on authenticity and implementing the spirit of the policy. And then the question goes on to say they're concerned because they've had some frustrations with their local principal and district in terms of including parent and community voice. And that the questioner wants to make sure we avoid tokenism. So very fitting last question given the subject today. So if you want to address that.
I think you're right. This is the core issue and really critical to both meeting the letter and the spirit of the law. We're still working through it, honestly, and really trying to identify how do we convey and really reach authentic community engagement. And it is going to require some fundamental change in terms of how we interact. And I think it's partly why Eduardo was lifting up that this has to be a year-round process. It can't just be a check the box because you've met with the advisory committee and you've had your 2 hearings. That if you're going to bring people along and engage them and actually build from their assets and their knowledge of the need, there are steps along the way year-round to be able to do that. And maybe I'll turn it to you since you're our reigning expert on this fun stuff.
No, I think you're absolutely right on that, Samantha. It is an area of incredible growth that a district can experience when they do engage in authentic community voice. And we are in the process of developing some concrete tools and resources for community members to be able to just download and tweak and use to inform how they engage their communities in an authentic process. So keep your eyes on your emails and on the newsletters so that you are abreast of those opportunities as they arise.
And that tweet chat really is a space for us, I think, organically to kind of start sharing a lot of the things that we know. I mean, there's 6 million kids, 300,000 staff, teachers up and down the state. There's 1,000 districts. We're all going to have to be in this together and really share information, see where it's working, where it's not working, and do that kind of ongoing reflection and strengthening, because we're not going to get it perfect coming out the gate, but we got to keep at it because it is so important.
Great. And with that, we are out of time. Sam, do you want to wrap things up? And just want to thank everyone for joining. But Sam, do you want to do the official close?
Yeah, no, thank you all for joining. We again are so grateful for all the partners that we have on the phone and want to learn from you and really appreciate you giving us the time to lay this groundwork and keep moving forward on this front. Thank you all so much.